Autumn 1937, Shanghai, China. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, a suffocating blend of humidity, fear, and the acrid tang of burnt cordite. Buildings that had once scraped the sky, monuments to a burgeoning modernity, now stood as skeletal husks, their steel bones twisted, their brick facades pockmarked by shrapnel. Along the pulverized Suzhou Creek and deep within the labyrinthine alleyways of the city's international concessions, the Battle of Shanghai raged. It was a hellscape of urban warfare, a desperate, protracted struggle that defied all Japanese expectations of a swift, decisive victory. Among the beleaguered Chinese defenders, a particular sight caught the eye of seasoned forum observers. Chinese soldiers, often young and weary, but moving with a practiced discipline, their steel helmets bearing a distinctive, angular design, their rifles, Mauser pattern, performing with unnerving precision. These were not just any soldiers. These were the vanguard of China's modernizing army, units forged and trained with the meticulous, almost clinical expertise of German military advisors. This was no ordinary conflict. It was the opening act of a struggle that would engulf China for 8 brutal years, a fight that predated Europe's wider conflagration by 2 years, but was inextricably linked to it. And at its heart lay a story rarely told in the West, the clandestine, complex, and ultimately tragic military alliance between nationalist China and Nazi Germany. This wasn't merely a transactional relationship, it was a deeply entwined partnership that shaped the early phases of China's resistance against Japanese imperialism, a strategic gamble for both nations, and a poignant testament to the shifting sands of global power. It would profoundly influence China's ability to resist, leaving an enduring, if often unacknowledged, legacy on the battlefield and in the geopolitical calculations of the major powers. To understand this unlikely pairing, we must rewind to the ashes of the Great War and the burgeoning ambitions of two nations yearning for ascendancy on the world stage. Germany, humbled by the Treaty of Versailles, was systematically rebuilding its military and industrial might in the shadows. Stripped of its colonial possessions and facing severe restrictions on its armed forces, Berlin sought new markets, new sources of raw materials, and strategic allies who could circumvent the Allied powers' watchful gaze. China, on the other hand, was emerging from centuries of imperial decline, fractured by warlordism, humiliated by foreign encroachments, and desperately seeking a path to national strength and unity. Under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang, the nationalist government, sought to modernize its vast but antiquated army, industrialize its economy, and create a centralized state capable of standing toe-to-toe with Imperial Japan and the encroaching specter of communism. The seeds of this alliance were sown in the late 1920s. Chiang Kai-shek, educated in Japan but deeply wary of its imperial ambitions, looked to Europe for models of national strength. Germany, with its formidable military tradition and burgeoning industrial capacity, presented an attractive, unaligned partner. Unlike Britain, France, or the United States, Germany had no colonial claims in China, making it a politically palatable choice. The initial contacts were tentative, often facilitated by discreet intermediaries. Key figures in Germany, particularly those within the Reichswehr, the German armed forces allowed under Versailles, saw China as a potential future counterweight to the Soviet Union and a rich source of critical raw materials. Tungsten for armaments, antimony for hardening steel, tin for industrial applications. These materials were vital for Germany's clandestine rearmament, which was already underway long before Hitler's rise to power. Early German military advisors began arriving in China in the late 1920s, quietly laying the groundwork. Men like Max Bauer, a former aide to General Ludendorff, brought with them a deep understanding of modern staff work, logistics, and strategic planning. They found a Chinese army that, despite its immense numbers, was largely a collection of regional militias, poorly equipped, often underfed, and lacking in standardized training and command. The task was monumental: to transform this disparate force into a professional, modern fighting machine. The advisor's influence grew significantly after the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, which starkly underscored China's vulnerability. Chiang Kai-shek realized that time was running out. He committed fully to the German model. The mission was not merely to sell arms, it was to overhaul China's entire defense infrastructure. This included the establishment of military academies based on German curricula, the training of Chinese officers in Germany itself, and the systematic reorganization of Chinese divisions along German lines. The pivotal figure in this transformation was General Alexander von Falkenhausen. Arriving in China in 1934, Falkenhausen was no ordinary military attaché. A highly respected veteran of World War I, with experience in general staff planning and a keen understanding of modern combined arms warfare, he quickly became Chiang Kai-shek's most trusted foreign military advisor. His mandate was sweeping: to prepare China for an inevitable existential war with Japan. Falkenhausen's vision was holistic. He understood that simply providing weapons was insufficient. A modern army required a modern industrial base to sustain it. He emphasized standardization, logistical efficiency, and the creation of an officer corps capable of independent tactical thought within a unified strategic framework. Under Falkenhausen's guidance, approximately 10 model divisions were meticulously developed. These divisions were the cream of the Chinese army. They were equipped with German-manufactured weapons, 15 centimeters and 10.5 centimeters howitzers from Krupp, state-of-the-art anti-tank guns, Mauser Kar-98K rifles, and advanced light machine guns. Uniforms were standardized, often based on German patterns, and the iconic Stahlhelm helmet became a symbol of these elite units. Training was rigorous, focusing on fire and maneuver tactics, coordinated artillery support, and defensive fortifications, all direct applications of German military doctrine. Chinese officers returned from German academies imbued with Prussian discipline to serve as the backbone of these reformed units. Beyond the battlefield, German expertise permeated China's nascent industrial sector. Factories were established with German assistance to produce ammunition, small arms, and even a limited number of armored vehicles. German engineers helped China extract and process the vital raw materials it was supplying to the Reich. This was a true partnership. China's vast resources fueled Germany's rearmament, while Germany's advanced technology and military doctrine fueled China's desperate quest for national strength. The scale of the trade was staggering. By 1936, China was Germany's second-largest trading partner in Asia. The fruits of this intense, years-long collaboration were put to the ultimate test in the summer of 1937. On July 7th, the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing ignited the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan, a rising imperial power with a highly disciplined and technologically superior military, expected a quick, decisive victory, much like their conquests in Manchuria. Their war plans envisioned subjugating China within 3 months. They were about to learn a harsh lesson. August 13, 1937, the Battle of Shanghai began. Japan unleashed its full might. Naval bombardment from battleships anchored in the Yangtze, devastating aerial assaults from squadrons of modern fighters and bombers, and well-equipped ground forces advancing with superior armor. Against this onslaught, the Chinese army, including its 10 German-trained divisions, stood firm. Chiang Kai-shek, advised by Falkenhausen, made the strategic decision to commit his best forces to defend Shanghai, even at immense cost. This wasn't merely about holding a city. It was about forcing Japan into a protracted, grinding urban battle, draining their resources and shattering their illusion of a swift conquest. It was a strategy of attrition, designed to buy China precious time. The fighting was brutal, house to house, block by block. The German-trained divisions, though numerically inferior and outgunned in terms of heavy equipment, fought with a ferocity and tactical sophistication that stunned the Japanese. They employed meticulously prepared defensive lines based on German doctrines of staggered strongpoints and interlocking fields of fire. Anti-tank teams, often armed with makeshift explosives and rudimentary German-supplied anti-tank rifles, bravely confronted Japanese light tanks. Artillery barrages, though limited, were coordinated with infantry movements, a rarity in the largely unmodernized Chinese army. One iconic example was the defense of the Sihang warehouse by the 800 heroes, a single battalion, around 400 men, though publicly declared as 800 for propaganda, holding off overwhelming Japanese forces for days under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Shi Jinyuan, who himself had received German training. This desperate stand, fought from a fortified position overlooking the Suzu Creek, became a symbol of Chinese defiance and resilience. It showcased the tactical effectiveness that German training could instill even in extreme circumstances. The warehouse, riddled with bullet holes and shell fragments, became a defiant middle finger to Japanese aggression, visible to the international observers across the creek in the foreign concessions. General Falkenhausen remained a constant, steady presence during the battle. He advised Chiang Kai-shek against suicidal frontal assaults where Chinese forces lacked adequate fire support. Instead, he championed the strategy of drawing Japan into a prolonged engagement, a bloody siege that would exhaust their resources and expose their vulnerabilities. His strategic insights helped turn what could have been a rapid collapse into a 3-month-long inferno, costing Japan tens of thousands of casualties and utterly destroying their timeline for conquest. The battle cost China even more, an estimated 250,000 casualties, but it bought China crucial time for the government and key industries to relocate inland, establishing a strategic redoubt in Chongqing. However, as the Sino-Japanese War intensified, the delicate geopolitical balancing act supporting the German-Chinese alliance began to unravel. Germany's ambitions under Hitler were shifting dramatically. The Anti-Comintern Pact, signed between Germany and Japan in 1936, had been a clear signal. While initially presented as an anti-Soviet alliance, it increasingly became a strategic bloc against the Western democracies, and implicitly against Germany's continued support for China. Japan applied intense diplomatic pressure on Berlin to sever ties with Chiang Kai-shek. Hitler, now firmly committed to his own expansionist plans in Europe and seeking to consolidate alliances that would serve his immediate strategic needs, ultimately chose Japan. Japan was a powerful partner in the Pacific, capable of diverting Anglo-American attention and resources, and a fellow authoritarian state. China, despite its vast potential, was a distant client, increasingly entangled in a losing war across its vast hinterland. Spring 1938, Hankou, China. The directive from Berlin arrived. All German military advisors were to return home immediately. It was a crushing blow to Chiang Kai-shek and his government, a betrayal by a trusted partner. Chiang made a desperate personal appeal to General Falkenhausen, offering to fund a small private advisory group to continue their work outside official channels. Falkenhausen, a man of honor who had grown to respect and admire the Chinese soldiers he had trained, was deeply conflicted. He had witnessed their courage firsthand, their unwavering determination in the face of overwhelming odds. He genuinely believed in their cause, but Hitler's regime was not to be defied. Under direct threats against his family in Germany, a chilling indication of the Gestapo's reach, Falkenhausen was compelled to leave. He departed in June 1938, but not before extracting a promise from Chiang Kai-shek never to enter an alliance with the Soviet Union, and offering a personal assurance that he would never advise Japan against China. He upheld that pledge, even later being imprisoned by the Gestapo during World War II for his anti-Nazi sentiments. The departure of the German advisors marked the effective end of an era. It was a catastrophic loss for China. The flow of German arms ceased abruptly. The vital military training programs halted. China was deprived of its most experienced foreign strategic minds just when it needed them most, facing a technologically superior foe on multiple fronts. The model divisions, once the pride of the Nationalist army, found themselves without replacements for their specialized equipment and without the continuous influx of training and expertise. They were slowly decimated in subsequent brutal campaigns, the Battle of Wuhan, the Battle of Changsha, their German-trained officers and NCOs often fighting to the death, leaving behind a legacy of immense sacrifice. Yet the legacy of the German connection was not entirely erased. The organizational structures, the tactical principles, and the emphasis on a modern professional officer corps instilled by the Germans continued to exert influence throughout the arduous war. The core of German-trained cadres, though depleted, formed a crucial leadership element in many fighting units, even as the war forced China into a brutal strategy of attrition and defense in depth across its vast hinterland. These men, scarred by experience, but imbued with a deeper understanding of modern warfare, understood the importance of a professional military, of logistics, and of combined arms, even when the resources for them were painfully scarce. They became the bedrock upon which subsequent, often American-led reforms would attempt to build. Consider the immense logistical challenge China faced. After the fall of its coastal cities, the country's lifeline became the Burma Road, a monumental engineering feat, a treacherous, hand-carved route winding through mountains and jungles. Supplies, later predominantly American Lend-Lease, poured in through this artery. But the ability to effectively receive, distribute, and utilize these supplies, however imperfectly, was partially a testament to the organizational improvements fostered by the earlier German advisors. The very notion of a more centralized, professional military command, however imperfectly realized in the vast and often corrupt KMT system, owed something to the earlier German period. It provided a conceptual framework for modernization, even if the practical implementation was often hampered by internal politics and resource scarcity. The Sino-Japanese War, which raged from 1937 to 1945, was a separate yet integrated component of World War II. It was a war of unprecedented scale and brutality. China tied down an enormous number of Japanese troops, often over 1 million men, for 8 long years. These divisions, elite and battle-hardened, could have been deployed against the United States in the Pacific, against the British in Southeast Asia, or against the Soviet Union in Manchuria. China's steadfast resistance, therefore, was a crucial, if often unacknowledged, contribution to the overall Allied victory. Without China's relentless struggle, the global conflict would have played out very differently. Later in the war, the focus of foreign assistance shifted to American support. General Joseph Stilwell, Vinegar Joe, arrived in 1942, tasked with reforming the Chinese army and integrating it more effectively into the Allied war effort. Stilwell's mission was fraught with challenges, clashing frequently with Chiang Kai-shek over issues of command and strategy. Yet even Stilwell, despite his frustrations with the Nationalist leadership, implicitly built upon some of the foundations laid by the Germans. He too sought to professionalize a largely agrarian army, to train elite units, and to establish better logistical chains, goals that resonated with Falkenhausen's earlier work, albeit with different methods and under vastly different strategic circumstances. The American-trained X-Force and Y-Force, fighting in Burma, would embody a new peak of Chinese military effectiveness, but their genesis, in part, can be traced back to the earlier efforts to modernize the KMT army. The complex, often paradoxical story of Germany and China during World War II is a poignant reminder of how rapidly shifting alliances and cold, pragmatic national interests can create unexpected partnerships and equally unexpected betrayals. It underscores the immense, often tragically overlooked contributions of China to the Allied cause. For 8 long, agonizing years, China alone bore the brunt of Japan's full military might, preventing its deployment against Allied forces across the entire Pacific theater. The Chinese war effort, costly in human lives, material resources, and cultural heritage, was a crucial and indispensable front of World War II. Post-war, General Falkenhausen himself would face scrutiny for his role during the war, ironically imprisoned by the Nazis late in the conflict for his independent spirit and anti-Hitler sentiments. His time in China remained a distinct, proud chapter of his life. His respect for the Chinese soldiers he trained and fought alongside was evident in his later reflections. He saw their bravery, their resilience, and their potential, even when facing overwhelming odds. The Chinese soldiers, particularly those in the German-trained divisions, fought with incredible courage and tenacity, absorbing the best of German military discipline and combining it with their own deep-seated resilience and profound commitment to defending their homeland. The German military presence was not without its shadows. German economic interests were not always altruistic, and the relationship was at times strained by the differing priorities of Berlin and Nanking. Some German advisors viewed the Chinese as inherently inferior, and friction often arose between the disciplined German approach and the realities of Chinese bureaucracy and political infighting. Yet despite these tensions, a genuine professional respect often developed between the German officers and their Chinese counterparts, a bond forged in the shared understanding of military science and the looming threat of Japanese aggression. The economic and industrial dimensions of the alliance were equally profound. Germany provided modern machine tools, chemical plants, and expertise that laid some of the groundwork for China's industrial base, particularly in heavy industry. German firms like Siemens and AEG invested in Chinese infrastructure, bringing electricity and modern communications to parts of the country. This transfer of technology, though interrupted by the war, had a long-term impact on China's developmental trajectory, demonstrating a path to industrialization that transcended mere military hardware. When the alliance broke, it was a double blow. Not just the loss of military aid, but also the cessation of vital industrial support, forcing China to scramble for alternatives from other, often reluctant, Western powers. The strategic consequences of this alliance, both its existence and its termination, reverberated globally. For Germany, it was a short-term gain for its rearmament, securing vital raw materials. But the betrayal of China eventually pushed Chiang Kai-shek closer to the Western democracies, and, critically, solidified the Sino-Japanese conflict into a full-blown war, tying down millions of Japanese soldiers who might otherwise have threatened Soviet Siberia or intensified pressure on British and American Pacific territories. The decision to prioritize Japan over China, while seemingly pragmatic for Hitler in 1938, arguably contributed to a more protracted and resource-intensive global conflict for the Axis. For China, the German period represented a crucial, if ultimately insufficient, window of opportunity for modernization. It provided the most effective military training and equipment available to China before the full-scale conflict, a period of intense reform that elevated a segment of its vast army to a truly modern standard. Without this foundation, the initial resistance against Japan in 1937 might have collapsed far more quickly, with far more catastrophic consequences for Chinese morale and national cohesion. The Battle of Shanghai, a symbol of China's resilience, would have been fought with far less effectiveness and at even greater cost if it could have been fought at all without the German-trained divisions. The enduring myth of the 8 million nationalist soldiers who fought in World War II often overshadows the intricate details of their capabilities. Many were still poorly trained and equipped, fighting with an almost suicidal bravery. But the existence of the German-trained elite units meant that China possessed certain teeth, certain capabilities that allowed it to inflict disproportionate casualties on Japan in key engagements. These elite units, though numerically small, acted as a force multiplier, giving the Chinese high command options and tactical flexibility that would otherwise have been unthinkable. They demonstrated that, with proper training and equipment, the Chinese soldier was a formidable adversary. The termination of the alliance had psychological repercussions too. It forced China to rely even more heavily on its own internal resources and resilience. It underscored the brutal realities of international politics, where national interest often trumped sentiment or shared ideological opposition to aggression. This sense of isolation, however, also forged a deeper resolve within the Chinese populace, uniting them against the common Japanese enemy. The idea of total resistance became paramount, a commitment to fight until the very last, knowing that external support was fickle and ultimately conditional. The scale of China's sacrifice during the war is almost unimaginable. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 15 to 20 million Chinese died, both military and civilian, from combat, starvation, disease, and atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre. Hundreds of cities were devastated, vast swaths of agricultural land laid waste, and industrial capacity crippled. This immense human cost, this protracted struggle, was largely borne by China itself, with limited and often begrudging support from its Western allies until much later in the conflict. The ghost of the German alliance, a reminder of what might have been, lingered over this desperate fight. When we speak of World War II, our focus often turns to the European and Pacific theaters, to D-Day and Pearl Harbor, to Stalingrad and the Blitz. Yet the war in China was an immense, crucial front, a struggle of unparalleled human suffering and strategic importance. The German-Chinese alliance, though a brief and ultimately ill-fated chapter, was instrumental in shaping China's capacity to resist in the early critical years. It provided the blueprints, the training, and the initial equipment that allowed a fragmented nation to begin its journey towards fielding a modern army. The KMT Army, despite its internal flaws and the later devastating civil war with the Communists, was forged in the crucible of this period. Its core leadership, its strategic thinking, and its understanding of modern warfare were indelibly marked by the lessons learned from German advisors. The very concept of national defense, of a unified military strategy, evolved significantly during these years of German tutelage. The story of Germany and China in World War II is not just a tale of weaponry and tactics, it's a narrative of the interconnectedness of global events, of the complex web of diplomacy, economics, and military strategy that defined the era. It shows how nations, driven by desperate needs, could form alliances that defied ideological boundaries, only to see them shatter under the immense pressures of a world descending into total war. It highlights the profound impact of industrial capacity and modern military doctrine on a nation's ability to survive an existential threat. The lessons learned by the Chinese soldiers and commanders during this period, particularly those instilled by the German advisors, would continue to resonate. They informed the defensive strategies, the logistical challenges, and the hard-won tactical experience that allowed China to hold the line for years. While the ultimate victory came with the broader Allied triumph, China's ability to persist, to tie down Japan's military, was a critical precondition for that victory. The very landscape of China, from the bombed-out streets of Shanghai to the fortified mountain passes of the interior, bore witness to this struggle. The rivers ran red, the earth swallowed millions, but the resistance continued. And in that resistance, however distant and desperate, there was a quiet, almost forgotten echo of German military precision, a testament to a fleeting, pragmatic alliance that helped China find its footing in the brutal dance of 20th century warfare. The dragon, though wounded and alone, had been given a spine of German steel, and it used it to defy an empire for 8 long, agonizing years. The full human cost, the strategic implications, and the sheer endurance of the Chinese people in the face of this unparalleled aggression remain one of the most compelling and essential narratives of World War II. A narrative where the ghost of a German alliance played a crucial, if ultimately tragic, supporting role. This intricate dance of global powers, driven by both shared necessity and cynical realpolitik, irrevocably shaped the destiny of millions. It underscores that World War II was not just a European or Pacific conflict, but a truly global catastrophe, with intricate, often overlooked chapters like this German-Chinese alliance that contributed significantly to its unfolding. The resilience of the Chinese people, hardened by this brutal experience, stands as an enduring monument, a testament to a fight that, with its initial, unlikely German spine, fundamentally altered the course of history. The Dragon's American Lifeline, Stilwell, Burma, and China's enduring struggle. The departure of General Alexander von Falkenhausen and his German advisors in mid-1938 left a profound void. China, now truly alone against the full might of Imperial Japan, retreated further into its vast interior, trading space for time. The initial, desperate German-influenced resistance had bought precious months, allowing for the relocation of vital industries and the nationalist government to Chongqing, the mountain city, which would become the wartime capital. Yet the strategic betrayal by Germany underscored a painful truth. China's survival depended not just on its own immense resilience, but on securing external support from an increasingly fractured world. The fight was far from over. It had merely entered a new, even more agonizing phase. As the war in Europe exploded in 1939 and Japan tightened its grip on China's coastline, Chiang Kai-shek's government looked with increasing urgency towards the Western democracies, particularly the United States, hoping for a lifeline across the vast Pacific. This lifeline, when it finally materialized after Pearl Harbor, came in the form of Lend-Lease aid, military advisors, and a cantankerous, brilliant American general, Joseph W. Stilwell. His mission, as the Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek, commander of U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India Theater, and Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of the Southeast Asia Command, was monumental. to transform China's vast but often inefficient army into an effective fighting force, reopen a land route to China through Japanese-held Burma, and integrate the Chinese war effort into a coordinated Allied strategy. It was a task that would test the limits of diplomacy, military prowess, and sheer human endurance, defining a crucial, often turbulent chapter in China's World War II experience. Stilwell arrived in China in March 1942, just months after the Japanese swept through Southeast Asia, seizing Hong Kong, Singapore, and, critically, Burma. The fall of Burma was a strategic disaster for China. It severed the last land route for supplies, the treacherous but vital Burma Road, which had for years funneled desperately needed war materials from the Indian Ocean into China's beleaguered interior. With its coast blockaded and its internal lines of communication stretched thin, China was effectively cut off, forced to rely on a perilous aerial supply route over the hump of the Himalayas, a logistical marvel, but one that could only deliver a fraction of what was needed. Stilwell, a tough, no-nonsense infantryman who spoke fluent Mandarin and understood the complexities of Chinese culture better than most Westerners, was quickly dubbed Vinegar Joe by his troops for his demanding nature and acerbic wit. He was deeply committed to the Chinese soldier whom he believed possessed immense courage and fighting potential if only given proper training, equipment, and leadership. However, he quickly ran head-on into the intractable realities of nationalist Chinese politics and the deeply entrenched distrust between Chiang Kai-shek and his military commanders. Chiang Kai-shek, while desperate for American aid, harbored a profound suspicion of foreign influence and was deeply protective of his authority. He viewed the war against Japan not just as a military struggle, but as a political one, aimed at preserving his regime and consolidating power against the looming threat of the Chinese communists. He was reluctant to commit his best divisions to offensive operations in Burma, fearing heavy losses and preferring to hoard them for a future confrontation with Mao Zedong's forces. Stilwell, on the other hand, saw only one enemy, Japan. He advocated for immediate, aggressive action to retake Burma, reopen the land route, and train a modern Chinese army capable of driving the Japanese out of China itself. The clash of these two visions, the pragmatic realism of the battlefield versus the complex calculus of Chinese internal politics, became the defining tension of the CBI theater. Stilwell believed that the Chinese army, despite its vast numbers, over 3 million men, was largely ineffective due to poor training, rampant corruption, inadequate logistics, and ineffective leadership, particularly at the higher echelons. He famously referred to Chiang's regime as the peanut and constantly battled against what he saw as obstructionism and a lack of will to fight. Stilwell's primary focus became the rehabilitation of the Chinese army. He envisioned creating 30 modernized divisions trained and equipped to American standards that could launch a coordinated offensive. This ambitious plan began in India, where Chinese troops who had retreated from Burma were reorganized into two new armies, the Chinese Army in India, X-Force, and later in Yunnan, China, Y-Force. These forces, largely funded by Lend-Lease and advised by American officers, underwent rigorous training programs in modern infantry tactics, artillery use, logistics, and combined arms operations. They were equipped with American M1 rifles, BARs, machine guns, mortars, and light artillery. American medical teams addressed the rampant disease and malnutrition that plagued Chinese units, boosting morale and effectiveness. The X-Force became Stilwell's pride. Trained in the jungles of Ramgarh, India, these divisions, the new First Army and the new Sixth Army, were transformed into formidable fighting units. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and led by a mix of capable Chinese officers and American advisors. This was a radical departure from the norm in the Chinese army, where soldiers were often seen as expendable and logistics were an afterthought. The investment in these units, in terms of human capital and material resources, was enormous, and Stilwell fiercely protected them. The immediate objective for these newly trained forces was Burma. The Allied strategy in Asia recognized that reopening a land route to China was paramount. Not only would it allow for massive increases in Lend-Lease supplies, but it would also serve as a crucial staging ground for future operations against Japan. The task was daunting. Burma's terrain was a nightmarish labyrinth of dense, malaria-infested jungles, towering mountains, and deep rivers, all defended by a tenacious and experienced Japanese Imperial Army. November 1943, Stilwell, personally leading his X-Force, launched the offensive into northern Burma. It was a campaign that pushed human endurance to its limits. American engineers, working alongside Chinese labor, carved the Lido Road, later renamed the Stilwell Road, through the unforgiving terrain, just behind the advancing front lines. This was more than just a military advance. It was a race against time and nature to build a road, pipeline, and communication lines that would sustain China's war effort. The fighting was savage. The Chinese X-Force, under Stilwell's direct command, proved their mettle. They engaged in brutal jungle warfare, often outmaneuvering and outfighting the Japanese, something many Western observers had believed impossible. Battles for key positions like the Kamaying Road and the crucial Japanese stronghold of Mait Kiina became legendary for their ferocity and the sheer determination of the Chinese and American troops. Mait Kiina, in particular, was a grinding, weeks-long siege fought in monsoon conditions where disease and exhaustion claimed as many lives as enemy bullets. While the X-Force was fighting its way through northern Burma, the Y-Force, Chinese divisions trained in Yunnan, China, were meant to launch a coordinated offensive from the east. But political wrangling and Chiang Kai-shek's reluctance to commit his best troops often delayed their movements, much to Stilwell's frustration. Despite these setbacks, the combined pressure eventually began to crack the Japanese defenses. The complexities of the CBI theater were not limited to the ground war. Over the Hump airlift, operating from bases in India, became the primary artery for supplies to China. This operation, flying C-47 and later C-46 transport planes over the treacherous Himalayas, often without reliable navigation aids and under constant threat from Japanese fighters, was one of the most dangerous and logistically challenging endeavors of the war. Thousands of flights, thousands of tons of material, and hundreds of lost aircraft became a testament to the desperate need to keep China in the fight. Pilots, both American and Chinese, battled extreme weather, mechanical failures, and the constant threat of Japanese ambushes. The planes, often stripped of defensive armament to carry more cargo, became flying targets for Japanese Zeros and K-43 Oscars. Stilwell's relationship with Chiang Kai-shek deteriorated rapidly. Stilwell, a soldier's soldier, had little patience for political maneuvering, and even less for what he perceived as Chiang's unwillingness to fully commit to the fight. He consistently pressed for reforms, for greater transparency in the distribution of Lend-Lease aid, and for the integration of the Chinese Communists into a unified command against Japan, a proposition anathema to Chiang. Stilwell believed that a more democratic and unified China would be a stronger ally, while Chiang saw any concession to the Communists as a direct threat to his post-war leadership. Chiang, in turn, viewed Stilwell as arrogant, disrespectful and overly focused on the Burma campaign at the expense of China's internal security. He resented Stilwell's direct access to President Roosevelt and his frequent critical reports on the nationalist regime. The tension reached its peak in 1944, during the disastrous Japanese Ichigo offensive in China. This offensive, one of the largest Japanese ground operations of the war, shattered China's defenses in several provinces, seizing vital airfields that had been used by American bombers, the B-29s, for operations against Japan, and opening a land corridor through China to French Indochina. Stilwell saw the Ichigo offensive as a definitive proof of the Chinese army's disorganization and Chiang's failure to effectively lead. He believed that only by giving him full command of all Chinese forces could the tide be turned. President Roosevelt, at Stilwell's urging, sent a direct message to Chiang demanding that Stilwell be given unrestricted command of all Chinese armies. Chiang, viewing this as a direct challenge to his sovereignty and dignity, refused, threatening to break off relations with the U.S. if Stilwell was not recalled. October 1944. After intense diplomatic wrangling, Roosevelt reluctantly recalled Stilwell. His departure was a victory for Chiang Kai-shek, but a strategic setback for the Allies, highlighting the profound difficulties of fighting a coalition war with disparate political and military objectives. Stilwell was replaced by General Albert C. Wedemeyer, a more politically astute officer who adopted a more deferential approach to Chiang, focusing on advising rather than commanding. Despite the political turmoil and Stilwell's eventual recall, his impact on the Chinese army, particularly the X-Force and Y-Force units, was undeniable. These forces, often referred to as Stilwell's Chinese or New Army units, proved to be remarkably effective in battle. The X-Force, fighting their way across northern Burma alongside the American Merrill's Marauders, played a decisive role in clearing the Japanese out of the region and ultimately reopening the Lido Road, renamed the Stilwell Road, in January 1945. The opening of the Stilwell Road, coupled with the continued Hump airlift, finally allowed for a substantial increase in supplies to reach China. By the end of the war, tens of thousands of tons of material, from trucks and jeeps to artillery and ammunition, had flowed into China, bolstering its remaining forces. While too late to fundamentally alter the course of the ground war within China itself, it provided critical support that allowed nationalist forces to hold their ground and to begin planning for future offensives. The training methods and organizational principles implemented by Stilwell and his staff laid the groundwork for further modernization. The establishment of training centers, the emphasis on logistics, and the care for the individual soldier, concepts Stilwell fought hard to instill, would endure even as China transitioned into civil war and later a new political order. The experience of fighting alongside Americans, of using modern equipment and tactics, instilled a new level of professionalism and confidence in the Chinese soldiers who passed through Stilwell's programs. The story of Stilwell in China is more than just a tale of military strategy. It is a profound human drama, a clash of cultures and personalities against the backdrop of an existential war. Stilwell's deep respect for the Chinese common soldier, whom he affectionately called the Gipper, was genuine, even as his contempt for the nationalist leadership grew. He saw the immense potential of China's human resources, if only properly harnessed and led. His efforts, though often frustrated, undoubtedly contributed to China's ability to remain in the war and to inflict significant damage on the Japanese. The broader significance of China's role in World War II cannot be overstated. From the opening salvos in Shanghai to the brutal jungle campaigns in Burma, China tied down millions of elite Japanese troops for 8 years. These troops, hardened by constant combat, could have been deployed to bolster defenses against the American island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, or to launch devastating offensives in Southeast Asia, or even to threaten the Soviet Union's vulnerable Siberian flank. China's unwavering, though often isolated resistance bought invaluable time for the Allies, stretching Japanese resources to their breaking point and ultimately contributing immensely to the Allied victory. The sheer scale of China's sacrifice is staggering, an estimated 15 to 20 million lives lost, vast swaths of its territory laid waste, and its economy shattered. The war against Japan was not merely a military conflict, it was a total war that consumed an entire nation, reshaping its landscape, its society, and its future. The American alliance, despite its internal friction, represented a crucial, if often imperfect, partnership in this struggle. It provided the technological edge, the logistical support, and the strategic coordination that allowed China to move beyond mere survival to actively engage and defeat the Japanese in critical areas like Burma. The Burma Road, and later the Stilwell Road, became symbols of this desperate global effort, concrete manifestations of the Allied commitment to keeping China in the fight. The thousands of men and women who labored on these roads, the pilots who flew over the Hump, and the soldiers who fought and died in the Burmese jungles all played their part in ensuring that China remained a vital front, draining Japan's resources and ultimately contributing to its defeat. The legacy of the CBI theater and of General Stilwell's tumultuous tenure continued to echo long after the war. The internal tensions between the nationalists and communists, so exacerbated by the pressures of a two-front war against Japan and each other, ultimately erupted into full-scale civil war shortly after VJ Day. The military reforms, the American equipment, and the training provided during the Stilwell era played a significant, if complex, role in that subsequent conflict, influencing the capabilities of both sides as they vied for control of post-war China. In many ways, the story of China in World War II is a narrative of profound resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, a testament to a nation's indomitable will to survive and resist. From the initial, unlikely German support that built a semblance of a modern army, to the contentious but ultimately vital American alliance that supplied and trained new forces, China's struggle was a constantly evolving dance of adaptation and endurance. It reminds us that victory in World War II was not just forged in the grand battles of Europe or the Pacific, but also in the forgotten jungles of Burma, the treacherous skies over the Hump, and the besieged cities of China, where the fate of millions hung in the balance, and a stubborn general called Vinegar Joe fought not just the enemy, but the very system he was sent to save. This was China's unseen, relentless war, a crucible that forged its destiny and profoundly shaped the 20th century.